Now, I'm curious about this, Scrump, because this is a topic, the next thing that we have, which is our next title story, which...
It is indeed a topic, yes.
It is a topic, but there's more.
A topic well pointed out.
Which I suspect you and I may disagree on to some extent. So let's see if we do. Bill Ackman says Martin Luther King would be opposed to DEI movement. And then we'll go on to, I think the next one after this will be the one that we disagree on, maybe somewhat. The billionaire hedge fund chief made the claim on an online conversation with Elon Musk and long-shot Democratic candidate Dean Phillips. Is that Dean Phillips? He looks like a plastic man.
A lot of them do.
I suppose so. Well, if he's just like talking candidly with these two, maybe he's a better Democrat than average. Billionaire hedge fund chief and burgeoning internet main character. Okay, thanks, Rolling Stone. Bill Ackman used the afternoon of Martin Luther King Jr. Day to claim the civil rights leader would have been against the movement for diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education and business. It's a claim that MLK's daughter has previously rejected. Well, not sure I'm very concerned about that, but never mind. Ackman made the comments during a space conversation on X, formerly Twitter, alongside Democratic presidential candidate Dean Phillips and X-owner Elon Musk on Monday. The discussion came 2 days after Ackman pledged to donate $1 million to a super PAC supporting Phillips' long-shot primary campaign against President Joe Biden. Ackman said that King's famed "I Have a Dream" speech is precisely about a world where people will be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And when I came to learn about the DEI movement, which is an ideological movement, it really is the reverse of that. So, I think this is something that we've been saying for about 10 years. This is not a new notion. On this side of the argument, the colorblindness, individualism, and meritocracy, which are implicit, very strongly implicit, in the "I Have a Dream" speech, are the correct way to deal with race relations, in my humble opinion, still. And DEI is exactly against that. Now, I've been making the argument that the left are the real racists. It's again, passé thing, but it does still bear repeating when we're specific that they have merely redefined racism and then done racism. That is in itself a problem to the exact extent that racism is the abandonment of that meritocracy, colorblindness, and individualism. So they are causing a problem by doing exactly what they say everyone else is doing, which is not an uncommon pattern. And what Martin Luther King advocates in that speech would be against it. So I think they are mostly right. The problem is that it's just a speech, and he didn't write it. I have no idea what MLK himself would think, and frankly, I don't need to know. I don't know much about the man.
I don't care.
Yeah, I don't know much about the man. I don't really care what he would say. What I care about is that he's right in that speech, or whoever wrote it is right in that speech. And DEI is the opposite of that. So I would not get bogged down in MLK the man. I would be concerned with the principles, because the principles are right. And if you ask most of the left, do they agree with the "I Have a Dream" speech, especially the sort of lower tier leftists, they will say, absolutely, it's about being racist. And then you start going through how their ideology is exactly the opposite of what's in that speech.
Well, the problem with the "I Have a Dream" speech is that a lot of it's just kind of like platitudes. You're right, he didn't write it. It's just a lot of it's very docile, like out-group rhetoric. And what people, I hate that politics, even on the right, has become about arguing about the legacy of Martin Luther King, because civil rights is a project that has been done very cynically. I think that the way things were written, the way things were set up, especially with how desegregation was done in America, was very cynical. It was run, the intention behind it, kind of by the wayside, it was run by a very corrupt elite who really, whatever your thoughts on the project, turned the project, inevitably, as always happens, to their own end. Because if you empower a government to decide what rights people do and don't have in like a racial sense, if you hand over racial arbitration to the state in a total sense, then they profit from it and they find ways to profit from it. And people saying that, yes, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a evolution of civil rights in a literal sense, because it's that process. It's like with the NHS and like national health services. If you give the government complete control over healthcare, they just run with it. They can do anything with it.
It's like a psychologist who doesn't want to solve your problem. They want to make you dependent on their service.
And even malice aside, the state is incentivized to do that internally. It always is.
Sure.
That's just how
So it's
public bodies work, and that's it is it's very simple, very well documented human psychology. It's some of the only human psychology hasn't but the replication crisis. But anyway, and I just hate that politics has become this performative clothing yourself in Martin Luther King when that's not really a way to have a substantive conversation.
Yeah. I sometimes bring up the I Have a Dream speech specifically because it contains things that people generally agree on this topic. It contains that colorblindness, meritocracy, and individualism approach to the issue. But I know nothing about the man, and I may have at some point advocated him, but not for years. So and that is, I think, the correct way to do it. So yeah, I agree with that. And I don't know that much about the specifics of the civil rights movement. I've really looked into it, but you may well be right that it was also similar to today, a sort of abuse of a tense situation by a small number of people, and then manipulating the rest into accepting it on their terms for their own benefit, or something along those lines.
Again, the I Have a Dream speech has lofty rhetoric in it, but putting that in reality just ends up with who arbitrates it is always the issue. It's just okay, you want this super fair colorblind society. If you hand over the arbitration of that to a government, then all you get is continuous incentivized racial conflict. So these people can ask for more power to sort out the problem in perpetuity. And the problem with the I Have a Dream speech is that you can't actually get rid of racism entirely without getting rid of human free will.
Sure.
People will always, in some capacity, choose to be racist. So really, it's kind of an appeal to nothing.
Well, it's an appeal to the notion that meritocracy can solve the problem. It does, if it does call for the government to solve it, I don't agree with that part. I may not agree with every word of it. Indeed, I agree with the parts I mentioned, but to the extent that it's individualistic in its from and to ends, that's how it should be done. And if people want to be racist about it, they can be, but the ideal is that they won't need to be. The ideal is that meritocracy solves that on an individualistic level.
It's really funny because a lot of people, I think, are reeing at you a bit, but they don't understand that if you combine your opinion on the I Have a Dream speech with your opinion on the statistics we just went over, it becomes a very different speech. It becomes a very different speech if you were to give
dude, if we're talking about judging by the content of character, and you find a consistent lack of character in certain people, judge away. I am for the truth first. I'm for the truth first, regardless of anything else.
That is the correct position. It's just yes, let's do I Have a Dream. Let's look at the content of your characters. Yeah. Oh dear. What do you mean you make $1.7 million a year? You go into a shop and you shoplift.
If there's
I think we can see the content of your character, can't we?
If there's a consistent content of character problem, then solve that problem. And the thing is, it's almost never going to be 100% blacks doing it. Even if it's 99%, it's still wrong to focus on the 1% who aren't that way. It's just not the way a just society works. And you don't want to be that one person in some other situation who's victimized because you've been identified as being in some arbitrarily defined group, which most of whom do something. You don't run a just society that way. It's always unfair on someone. So you do it based on the individual, which is already the policy. The problem is those policies are not being properly utilized because we have mostly evil people in positions of power. If you put the right will in positions of power and you just apply the existing principles, most of it works okay, with some things that should be removed from previous generations, but mostly it works fine. You apply the meritocratic principles, and the individuals who are doing something wrong get punished for it, the individuals who aren't, don't, regardless of race. That generally, I still think it's the correct approach to the issue.
I was going to say, not to get too bogged down, it's the way you always describe it, it does... there's a very, very fine distinction there, but there is almost like a social Darwinist aspect to it, which I find funny, because I don't think people realize that, yes, that is your position. You are quite hardcore in that position to a degree that a lot of people who also espouse that position, I think, would be very uncomfortable with. Because people do ree at you, but you are also a slight political authorist, and I get that you... I'm so sorry. A lot of people are like, oh, Scrump's just holding back. I understand his position because his position is right. If you actually do that, then a whole bunch of people fall foul of it. It does go that way. And I agree with you. There are always corner cases. You can't just say, right, no brown people, because that doesn't work. That just doesn't work. I know people are going to re at me, but even in the leftists have a point that even in like 15th, 16th century England, yes, there were traders from Africa in certain bits of the ports. Yes, there has always been interactions between different peoples. It's this weird, like super autistic one size fits all approach. And quite honestly, I think that there does need to be a degree of pragmatism in politics. But I think if you take the maximalist approach to an idea of a society where people are actually judged on who they are, then you do end up with some degree of almost social Darwinism. But so that's kind of by the by. There's a lot of stuff implicit in the other side of that message that a lot of people don't staunchly don't agree with, who also espouse it, which I think is one of the flaws really in that, because that worldview in quotes has become so fractured. There's so many different versions of it that to put that forward in many ways kind of becomes meaningless, because there's so many different people's interpretations of what a meritocracy is that it again, functionally it ends up saying nothing sometimes. But that's mostly just the fault of our incredibly degraded and cynical political theory. We are in a post-everything age, and words don't have meanings. Don't you just love being in the future?
I said that we may disagree on this because I've seen you say some things online, which I very respectfully, I'm not sure are true. We'll certainly get onto it. The article is entitled "DEI Goes Quiet." As corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs come under attack, some companies are rebranding their efforts. So I'm not sure if I've understood the article correctly from the headline. Maybe we don't disagree on this. Let's find out. Joel Emerson's DEI consultancy Paradigm works with more than 500 companies. The growing backlash against DEI, she said, is usually the first agenda item on every call. Critics of DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, have tried to scapegoat it for everything from regional bank failures to a panels ripping off a Boeing plane flight last week, which, to be fair, may have had nothing to do with it, but at the same time, you notice patterns. It could have done. That debate gathered pace this month as three famous billionaires clashed over DEI's merits on social media. In fact, this is the three that you were just talking about. Have attacked DEI efforts as racist, while the investor Mark Cuban agreed that they were good for business. I think they're only good for business because of artificial incentives that have been inserted into the market, specifically to destabilize the nations in which the market operates, but never mind. The economy and political landscape have changed since 2020, when companies hired DEI officers in droves amid a racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd. Shall we not get into it in detail, but that is bullshit. It was not a murder. Recently, DEI programs have become less visible, she says. Over the past 2 years, hiring for DEI roles has plunged, and the number of investor calls mentioning DEI has dropped. So since 2020, it rose steeply, and it's been gradually dropping ever since. On a decently steep line since then, actually. So some positivity there, it seems. What are you laughing about there, Scrump?
Oh, nothing. It's just I think that you think the problem is, I know what you're going to say, and that yes, you're right. They're not going to stop doing what they're doing. They're rebranding it. They are rebranding it. And what I say about like the woke being put away is the fact they're going to take the big wig off and the clown nose off, and they're going to say, "What do you mean? This is just normal colorblind policy, and we're giving, the poor, underprivileged brown people a bit of a leg up." They're going to try and make it sound neutral. It's like the whole thing with the war on terror. The war on terror never ended. They just stopped talking about it. It just stopped being in the news cycle. It just they bombed places, then just didn't announce it. In a lot of things. And that's what it's going to be. They're not going to start hiring more white people. They're just not going to say it as loudly anymore. And that's kind of the cultural paradigm. Woke isn't the fact that this has got worse. In fact, this hasn't got dramatically worse over the woke era than it was previously. It's actually been a gradual ramping up from the 90s onwards. It's the framing. The framing is what changes, and that's what they're talking about here, which is that diversity, equity, inclusion will be rebranded, but we'll talk about it like we talk about civil rights now, in a very neutral sense, in a very kind of value-free sense. We don't talk about civil rights like it's activists wearing clown wigs, like we do about woke stuff. But that's kind of the interplay here. Anyway, I kind of know where you're going with that, but that just to get out ahead of it slightly.
No, that's interesting. I hadn't heard it described in that detail actually. There's a possibility there. I think that's one interpretation of it, and I would want to give it some more thought before I give a response to all of that. But I suspect that trying to retract back from that stuff now would be difficult for them, because they have intensified so much and they have such an opposition that at the very least, their opposition aren't going to shut up about it, even if they do. And it may lead to more competing information sources if they just stop talking about it. But you may be right that the main thing that changed in 2012 was more talking about it. I do suspect there was more than that to it. It certainly seemed that there was.
It was still going on. It just wasn't called diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it will still be going on. It just won't be called diversity, equity, and inclusion anymore. It's really clear they do this every so often. It's they always change the name for it, but the song remains the same. And that's kind of been me trying to like shout at people that have been going like, no, it just like all these cultural paradigms people talk about, a lot of them aren't real. There's a long political project that's been going on for many, many, many years that it has very long time horizons. And what they do is they reframe it constantly. They just come up with another framing for the same thing so they can have the discussion in a different way. But really, as we've all seen in Britain with like New Labour being identical to the Conservative Party, that really there is this contiguous class of people who run the Western world, and they have their own political project, and that just continues on in the background, no matter what the headline. And that is the constant situation for most of us.
Maybe that's certainly one way of seeing it. I could see where you're coming from on that. Well, we'll see. We'll see if they do. I do think they're pretty close to the margin on this one, though. I guess would you maybe say then that the Occupy Wall Street movement was the last time that they got a lot of pushback, and then they just switched to some other issue? Do you think it's possible that they'll try and use the populist right? The press will try and use the populist right as their next foot soldiers and create the next big problem?
Yes. Yes, they will. And I already know what that problem is. They're doing freedom fries again. We're just having the war on terror again, guys. It's a fucking rerun. They're just doing a rerun.
I'm not sure that was going to fly because the populist right are quite anti-war.
Some of them are, unfortunately. Some of them aren't, and it's very. The thing is, the populist right were quite anti-war back in the 90s as well. They were the populist right, as opposed to like the establishment right, as it were, are two different things, and they always have been two different things. Yeah. And the problem is that all of the people in the Republican Party who are not Trump and not MAGA people are all extreme war hawks. If you look at the stuff to do with Yemen and especially the rest of it, like it's like the Democrats. The Democrats back in the war on terror were extremely pro-war in their voting, despite being vocally against it rhetorically. And I believe that will be the same thing with a lot of the quote-unquote populist politicians. They will rhetorically be against it, and when push comes to shove, just like the Democrats, war is a bipartisan project. And as you know, woke came out of somewhere. It was something that was propagandized on people. It was something that was instilled in people, and you can just instill different propaganda in people. It might cause a bit of cognitive dissonance in the short term, but if you instill it in a different group of people and you make that group of people your new foot soldiers, yes, I believe that the center right, in quotes, the war hawk center right, are going to be the next kind of foot soldiers of what the regime wants to do. And it won't be cognitive dissonance because it will feel like a different movement. It will feel like a different group of people. But I believe there's a de-emphasis going on the left and a re-emphasis going on the quote-unquote center-right. If you look at the Israel stuff, that's been a huge feature in Britain. Think about like the bizarre saturation level propaganda we've been having about how, well, yes, what Israel is doing is bad, but they have a right to do it. You see that everywhere. It's in every news story. And that seems to be the paradigm we're moving to, is this bizarre neo-war on terror. I agree with you, it won't work as well as the first time because they're all, like, to be fair, they're a lot less competent than they used to be. But I think that's at least what they're trying to do. Whether they can succeed is a very different story.
You may be right that they have that strategy in their sleeve. I don't think it's going to work very well, though. I think that it's not something that you can just continuously renew, and that the opposition that's risen up against them here is not quite that malleable, because it's not just an opposition to the ideas that they are purporting in the press. It's an opposition to the entire regime. And a lot of the MAGA movement is getting more and more aware of the shape of the regime above them. And the desperation with which they're acting these days leads me to believe that they're not quite that kind of a mastermind, that they don't quite have the power to do that. So maybe you're right that they had that up their sleeve, but I don't think it's going to work very well, anywhere near as well, possibly at all, if they do try it.
I think what we'll see, though, is a very public de-emphasization. I think we won't see woke in the media anymore. We won't see it especially pushed by the left. I think the left has realized it is a losing strategy in many ways. Many of the activist left have realized that they're just turning people off. And that really they have to reframe it in much more kind of Martin Luther King terms. They have to basically pretend that they're the heirs to I Have a Dream, rather than saying, jumping up and down and screaming, "Fuck you, whitey." That really there is a genuine sense of backfire. I do believe, as you do, that they've lost control of their own project in many ways. And there'll be a de-emphasis of it, but it will never go away. The activists won't go away. They'll continue to be a problem. And the sentiment behind it doesn't go away. They're not going to become, quote unquote, pro-native or pro-white or whatever in some way. It's going to continue. I just think they're going to shout it a lot less loudly. And they're going to try and rein in some of the activists who do shout it quite loudly. But we'll see if they can actually do that because it might be that they've just become too degraded too.
Yeah. It does sound similar to something that I've said, but structured differently. I suspect that there is going to be an overcompensation for the leftism of the sort of era that we're now sort of leaving. And that the right may become overcompensated. They may do too much. They may become too powerful, too adventurous with their ideas and implementing them. It may be that our ideas there are compatible, that we're talking about the same thing, but that it will in fact be mostly different people, but with a lot of the uniparty psychopaths in positions of power just glomming on to whatever gives them more power. But that that things are actually changing genuinely, but that the psychopaths will just move with the wind. That probably will happen, I think. And that may
there'll be an element of that too as well.
Yeah.
Yes. There is an element as well of the fact that once the change is signaled, that a lot of people will just kind of go with it.
There's also, I think our opponent's been relying a lot on both propaganda to negate the adaptive effects of democracy, but also election rigging. The propaganda won't go away, or it will never be able to be completely removed, or will never be able to be quickly removed. But the vote rigging, if you get someone like Trump in power, you get someone like Vivek in power, and they do have the good intentions, and they do have the ability to do these things, you get a bunch of good governors in positions of power, you can actually solve most of the vote rigging issue, isolate it to only a few places left. If you do that, you can start to actually get some healing in the system, because it is clear that the people are on this side currently. They do want that to happen. So I think if our opponent wants to do the idea that you're sort of suggesting there that they might do, I think they probably are underestimating the scope of the problem. Maybe they have done that in the past. I'm with you that that's possible. I don't think it'll work this time. I think they've taken it too far this time. Yeah, all right. I think we agreed a lot more than I expected there. Yeah.
The thing is, the way it can come across does sound a bit odd sometimes. Yeah. But
see,
really, what
I thought it was like a radically black-pilled sentiment that the lizard men have total control and they're just joking with you about this populist right movement. But actually, what you're saying is pretty reasonable.
It's really just the fact that every so often they have to change the propaganda record because people get used to the song.
Yeah. So they've essentially more strategies up their sleeve than we may have assumed. And that's a fair point. But yeah, they're gonna have to try it. I'm not sure it's gonna work. I was exaggerating. I didn't think you actually believed in lizardmen, but you get the idea, that the idea of it being a total control thing and that the populist right is just controlled opposition. That's why I assumed the direction you were going with it. And I have been dealing a bit too often with people ostensibly on this side of politics, but who are way too black-pilled and who aren't just not optimistic, but who try to reorganize the world to fit their pessimism, and who almost seem to wish for it to fail, so that in many cases, so that they can implement their proposed alternative ideal system. Perhaps I underestimated you in thinking that's what you were doing, because I have dealt with it a lot, and it sounded familiar.
No, the problem is that a lot of people wrap up that stuff with our stuff, and they think that we are people who just think that everybody, that there's this all-powerful force. And partially what we're trying to tell people is like, look, these people aren't actually that. They are powerful, but they're not that powerful. And most of all, they are becoming incompetent. There's no such thing as an incompetent regime, or at least not a fully incompetent regime. If a regime is fully incompetent, it is no longer competent enough to keep itself in power, and it will almost immediately collapse. There has to be some competency for someone to have an effective regime to oppress you, if you know what I mean. It sounds like a tautology, but I think that does hold in reality. Because if you have elites who are entirely incompetent, they aren't competent to self-perpetuate,